Excellent, thank you, and welcome to this PayProp HF Assist webinar. We're going to cover a number of exciting topics, depending on which side you've been on. Some of these conversations that Mike and Julie are going to give us some information on may decide how exciting you feel they are. But what we're actually going to look at is when, as a letting agent, we need that assistance. We're there to help things go smoothly. Unfortunately, when dealing with people and property, that's not always within our control. So what do we do when there are things outside of our control, or when we need assistance or the guidance on how to act properly? And that is where HF Assist are going to come in and show us how they do that with their agents. And we're also going to cover the very exciting topic later on when we look at the reasons for people making the call regarding the Renters Reform Bill. We, all of us, not that I'm saying we have no life, but we all spent yesterday evening delving into the detail of the Rental Reform Bill with highlighters and post-it notes, getting to grips with what they are looking to do to the private rented sector. And I think we've all got various views around some of the things that they're attending, but for the point of view here, while we're on this webinar, we think it'd be good to give you the main points of what this bill is aiming to achieve. There is still a lot of detail, and although we are here and there will be questions that you can frame, and if we can't get to them during the actual webinar, we will answer them all. But if a lot of those questions are around the detail of what is actually going to happen once the bill comes in, unfortunately, we have as little information as you may have at this point in time. But so when we're looking at this and going through the different things, I just want to quickly go in, because HF Assist might not be a name that everybody is familiar with. But I certainly think for anybody who operates within the private rented sector, we're quite aware of Hamilton Fraser Group and all of the things that are done. And we may deal with your redress schemes or your deposit systems. We may know Paul from his time on TV or his Rumble in the Jungle events. But I think we've all heard about the things that you do. And generally, all of those services are around professionalization, compliance, and helping the sector meet the rules that are being put out there by government. Is that a fair assessment, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's right. All of the touch points where you're going to get in hot water, we cover. So client money protection, PI insurance, landlord insurance, property redress scheme.
So I think for the people that we've got on, if we could just go through and just explain who we are as our panel here. I'll go through myself. We've got a very fun topic on there that says that I'm a prop tech evangelist. What that actually means is I'm very techie, and I'm going to try and tone that down for this, because what we actually want to do is to get into the rules, the regulations, and the practicalities of how we actually perform our lettings role, which is why when it comes to most of the questions and what actually people are occurring and the problems that you're getting when doing your job on a day-to-day basis, I'm actually going to defer to my left and my right here, because these are the people that actually sit in on that. So I'm going to go to Julie first. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you. My name is Julie Ford. I've got 30 years working within the private rented sector, as well as some time in the third sector working as a housing and homeless law specialist for the Citizens Advice. So my knowledge is pretty broad across the entire spectrum. I've also run my own lettings and property management company. So when I am giving advice to people on the helpline, it's coming from a business perspective as well as from a legal perspective in regards to what's the best option and the best plan of action for people. When we're giving advice, it doesn't always necessarily have to be about the law. Sometimes it is simply about how to run your business. So that's me, and I'm one of the advisors that you can always get on the phone Monday to Friday.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Julie. And I think that's really important that, yes, we are here to meet that compliance, but it is also we are business owners and running a business. And so putting it through that right spectrum, that we are looking at what is best to remain compliant, look after all the parties, which includes the letting agency themselves, is a good idea when actually approaching somebody to make sure they've got that knowledge. Mike.
Thanks, Neil. I'm Mike Morgan. I'm the team leader for HF Assist and also the membership and resolution lead for the property redress scheme. So lawyer by background, but worked in dispute resolution, alternative dispute resolution for most of my professional career. And I think really my passion now, having seen where it goes wrong and how to fix it, is increasingly about how can we not get to that stage, how can we get it right in the first place, how can we avoid those problems and not get ourselves into a pickle later on. So HF Assist is really good.
I think that for dispute resolution is always been the case. Prevention is better than the cure.
Yeah.
It's not always that easy to see how the prevention happens. So hopefully during this, and for the people that then use your services, you can help them navigate those ever twisting and winding ways to get to those.
Absolutely.
So I think, first of all, and I don't know which of you wants to lead this, but for those that aren't aware, if we tell them what is HF Assist, so I know who is HF Assist, or at least two of you now sat here, but what is HF Assist? And as a letting agent, what is my benefit in actually having a relationship with HF Assist?
I'll pick that one up if you like. So there are a number of advice lines out there for letting agents, but ours is different for a few reasons. We offer two types of service. So our standard membership is for a letting agent helpline. So that's normal business hours. But the big difference with our one is it's not just limited to telephone. We also do it by live chat. We also do it by email. So a lot of the helplines out there say we can only give telephone advice. We're increasingly getting more inquiries by live chat than we are by phone, because people can download that transcript of the conversation. So it's a nicer way of getting the evidence and having a note of what was covered. So that's really popular. We also, though, have a premium membership which gives some extras. So one of the premium benefits is an online members area with lots of guides, templates, documents that will help you. Two of our most popular guides, for example, one is an AST template. That will change. And the other one is a terms of business for agents management agreement with their clients. So those are getting downloaded all the time, and it's quite surprising how many people don't have them. The other thing that we do as a premium member is that you can access other Hamilton Fraser services at discount, and also there is access to a 24/7 legal helpline. So that is literally 24/7, and it's not limited to lettings advice. So that's any issues relating to your business. It also covers things like employment law, money advice, debt, tax, all those wider things that go around running a business, not just the lettings stuff. That all sounds very nice, and you might say, how much do I have to pay for this Rolls Royce service? The standard membership works out at £10 per month. The premium service is £20 per month, both plus VAT, and you can pay monthly on a direct debit, or you can pay for the year in full. The majority of our members, it's a no-brainer. They're going for premium membership at £20 a month. That's the big seller that everybody tends to go for.
Excellent. So then I now know what is HF Assist, and you gave me a little bit around kind of the whys, but if you could go into a little bit more of that detail of I'm sat here as a letting agent. I now know HF Assist is out there, is a legal helpline. I may have other member bodies or affiliations that I feel give me some access to some legal helplines. So why should I use HF Assist? This is your chance. Go on, sell out there.
Okay.
Why should I be coming?
So we've touched on ease of access, telephone, live chat, email. But I think the big thing that Julie's already touched on, which is I think is really our big difference, is that we're giving advice based on practical experience, not just legal knowledge. And I had a conversation with an agent last week who spoke to one of the legal helplines that you alluded to through one of the trade associations, and they said, the end of my conversation with the person was, so what would you do? And the response was, I can only give you the legal answer, which is something we would never do. We'll give you the legal answer because we can't avoid that, obviously, but we're more interested in the practical advice, the so what do I do? That's the big difference for us. I think the other thing is we can also call on expertise from other parts of the business. So sometimes when we're dealing with inquiries, we get into issues around PI insurance, client money protection, tenancy deposit protection, all of those other bits. And of course, they're just across the other side of the office. It's not just us that you can get the advice from. We know lots of people who can help with the wider things as well.
And I think it's important to point out that sometimes, however much you want to use a legal helpline, sometimes when that's tied to a member body or a membership or an affiliation that you have, it can be difficult to admit a problem, an error, or a situation that you find yourself in. And sometimes having an independent third-party advice line can allow you to be more open without a fear of reprisal to your affiliation or membership.
Yeah, I'd agree with that wholeheartedly. And again, echoing what Mike has said, you know, other advice lines that I've personally used and we hear that our members use are literally giving a black and white answer, whereas we are here to help explore the options. And then our members can go away empowered to make their own decision. And I think that's really important, because people are ringing up for advice and information to help them move forward, either with their landlord, their tenant, or their own business. If they're not given a definitive answer or an understanding of how to move that forward, they're no better off than when they hadn't rung. So from our perspective, moving that client forward is really important. And I think when you're ringing up and knowing that you're speaking to someone who's been there, done it, and got the t-shirt, not just someone who's employed to be an advisor, it's a very different approach.
I think that's absolutely right. And we, picking up on what you both said, we don't judge. We're not here to judge. We're not here to tell you you've got it wrong. We're here to help you get through
Solution focus, which is what you want for an assistance line.
And I think what I say on a daily basis to anyone that rings up, I've been doing this 30 years and every day I learn something new in property. There is never, ever a silly question. I can promise you that.
I have this lovely analogy with one of our members who said to me a little while back, he said, the nice thing about your helpline is it's a hug by phone.
I'm not sure I've rang a legal helpline before and felt I've had a hug. I might have to just ring up and see if I can experience this.
I asked him, what do you mean? And he said some of the things we've already said. You know, you don't beat me up, you don't tell me I'm wrong, you don't, you know, wag the finger and lecture me. You know, you help me understand what I need to do to get it right, what I need to do to avoid the problem happening again. And I feel happy that I phoned you, not chastened, and I know you know, next time I need you, I'm going to look forward to speaking to you again. So that was lovely feedback.
Fantastic. Well, that gives us a lovely segue there, Mike, into, you know, you tell me what I need to do so it doesn't happen again. What we're actually going to look at now is we're actually going to look at some of the top inquiries, not because we want to pick out what people have done or said or highlight anybody that's done something wrong, but more for that preventative measure, that these are the reasons, this is what we're coming across, and this is what you can be looking for in advance to make sure you're prepared for these situations. And I alluded to it at the beginning. This is our point. You can see from the top there, this was done. The webinar was announced long before we ever thought that our secretary for Levelling Up would actually release it. I've got to admit, I was a cynic myself. I was going for just before the Whitsun break. But they've given it now. They've got it out in a timely manner, and we've all had a little read through. Some of the things that are going to come up on this chat that we know about. So I see 6 main reasons, and please, we've all broken the bill down, so challenge me if you see that. The 6 main things to come out from the Renters Reform Bill is the one that everybody is aware of, is the abolishment of Section 21. And I'm not going to use that phrase no fault eviction, because I think anybody who operates in property doesn't use it as a no fault eviction route. Right. It is a Section 21, a mandatory return at the end of a tenancy agreement. That is what it is there for, and that is how I see it being utilised. But however we feel, it covers the Rental Reform Bill about the removal. At the same time, it does try and strengthen some of those other grounds. The Section 8, we are still to see how, following the announcement of the antisocial behaviour changes, they've not actually been detailed within it, but there are some other strengthening grounds regarding if you need it back for a sale. They have also expanded the moving into it to also include close family. So we have started to see things there. They're introducing a redress solely for landlords. And that will not be a discretionary basis. It will be mandatory for everybody to be a part of. There was an interesting phrase within there that I'm sure everybody picked up, and for a time after they have finished letting a property. which I think it'll be interesting once the detail comes out, how long a landlord has to remain a member of the redress at the point where they stop becoming a landlord. We also had the idea of a property portal, which we've known about, and the idea of a database to allow both tenants and landlords to be able to see that they've got all the required documentation. There was a section which was to cover rental increases, and they used a phrase to stop backdoor evictions. Don't think that is how anybody's seen to be using it. However, a lot of the mechanisms there don't change what is. There's a lengthening in some of the terms and the notice, but other than that, there's some questions that are going to come out in the detail regarding, and we've discussed it in the preparation for this, who sets that market rent, what happens, how is that going to be dealt with, and then kind of, I suppose, lastly was they were looking at where they were going to do and make all of these kind of changes and where they were going to sit within the legislation. They've made it quite open in section 4 and 5 to allow them to add things as it goes through the readings. And I think it'll be interesting to watch that passage through the courts as to what gets challenged. If you believe the papers, we're being told not everybody within the Conservative Party is necessarily happy with it. But I think as we see the readings, how much of that will actually come out. I do know that it was immediately got a lot of support, although blamed for the timeline by Labour, but they came out hugely supportive and mentioned that a lot of the measures, the redress, the property portal, the abolishment of Section 21 were in line with their changes to the PRS. So the rental reform bill is happening.
It is going to come.
It's going to come. It has a lot of support. What we now need to do is work together to make sure that the right things happen within the bill and there are no unintended consequences, such as what happened when we got the legislation and the non-serving of a gas safety meant that it could never be rectified. That was never the intention, but we don't want any of those unintended consequences with this. Now, you, prior to yesterday, already had one of your #1 inquiries is about the rental reform bill. How are you finding those questions coming in from customers? What's the sentiment of the people that ring in, that are ringing you about the renters reform bill?
I think for me, a lot of it is the not knowing, the fear of what's going to happen. How quickly is it going to impact? A lot of the questions that we're getting is, has Section 21 already disappeared? No, absolutely, it's still there. You can still use it. Don't worry about that. But also, when the renters reform bill becomes an act, how quickly do these changes implement? Now, that's always a really good question, because as we saw with Wales on the 1st of December last year, when their legislation came in, it was immediate. So it affected everything from the 1st of December. There was no more ASTs. It automatically became an occupation contract. Now, we're expecting to see something similar here with the renters reform bill. Now, I will say at the moment, this is the first draft of the bill. We've got the second reading today, and there will be secondary legislation that comes along with the bill. So what we're talking about now is only the first draft. But what we've seen is that as soon as the bill becomes an act, then it will actually become law. Whether that is straight away or whether there'll be a holding period, we don't know. So it will affect all tenancies immediately that are currently in existence, which means if there is a fixed term, it will stay a fixed term until it becomes a periodic, and then the law will affect it. So it will automatically be a periodic, and it'll be a periodic forevermore. No more fixed terms. If a tenancy is currently periodic when the law happens, it will stay a periodic, the law will enact it, and that will be it. That's the bare bones of it. We're not going to be seeing much of a transition period, because there's not going to be a requirement for a transition period, as tenancies automatically go from fixed term to periodic. But with the implementation of all the other parts of the act, the different grounds for possession, etc., we expect to see that almost immediately, unless a notice has been served already. That will continue to be valid until it's either been executed or expires.
I think that's a great summary. I think it's fear, isn't it? Fear of the unknown. And like you say, with Wales, we saw the same thing, and we were giving lots of guidance and drip feed guidance in the run up to the implementation date. So we'll be doing the same for this. And I think in Wales we've seen a lot of hand holding. So a lot of agents calling us up saying, right, I've done my occupation contract. What's the next bit? And we're taking them on that journey all the time. I think there's also fear with agents about their business model as well, because things like the change from no fixed terms to all periodics, that's going to impact their charging and their relationships with landlords. And I think, you know, having already suffered what they felt to be a painful transition with things like tenancy deposits, Tenant Fees Act, they're now seeing a, you know, even bigger looming cloud on the horizon with their management fees. So there's a lot of fear.
Excellent. Well, the last one I want to mention regarding the Renters Reform Bill, because it definitely splits the populace, is the pets in property. And you have your pet lovers to your not pet lovers, who will have different views on this. But ultimately, it is how I felt, but it has now been more clearly defined.
Yes.
So there was always, regarding anything, that it was unable to be denied unless there was a reasonable reason. You couldn't unjustly require it, but it has now been directly mentioned. However, there's a line in there that now says that they will also require the tenant to have pet insurance. And obviously, I think they need to clarify that, because most people who have a pet have pet insurance, but we're not talking pet insurance, we're talking pet damage insurance. And that pet damage insurance is quite problematic. A lot of insurers currently out there have quite a lot of exclusions. So it may cover certain types of damage, but scratching your sofa and things like that are not covered. And even if you pay for the higher levels, they still typically exclude things such as vomiting or fouling onto carpets, which are quite the most common damages that come across for a landlord where they've been let into a property. So how that plays out and how they get assistance from the insurance market, I think is going to be one to watch.
Yeah, and there are some commentators that are saying, how does that sit with the Tenant Fees Act? You know, if you're requiring them to pay money for insurance
well, it actually
into a tenancy.
Well, that actually does state that within the bill, that this is an amendment to the Tenant Fees Act as a permitted payment,
which is good, because before it was missed.
Yes, before it was missed. So then, why they're still here, the next one that we have on that list is obviously the notice periods for Section 8 and Section 21.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, probably on a daily basis, the question of how and when to serve notices. Now, at the moment, we still have Section 8 and we still have Section 21. So what a lot of people don't realise is there's actually 21 grounds under Section 8 that you can serve a notice on. Most people just predominantly think Section 8 is for rent arrears, grounds 8, 10 and 11. Now, each of those 21 grounds comes with a different notice period, so length of time you have to give the tenant to vacate the property. So looking at those different notice periods, knowing how much notice to give, and if you're using more than one ground and they've got different notice periods, which one do you then use first? How do you put that together on the notice? And then obviously with Section 21, there's still confusion whether a Section 21 has to be served in line with rent due date, because previously it did. But from the Deregulation Act in 2015, that was abolished. So you can serve a Section 21 at any point. It doesn't have to be in line with rent due anymore. However, if you serve it and the tenant has paid rent, they vacate and there's a bit of rent left over, you've got to repay that back.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And I think also people understanding it's not just serving the notice, particularly with Section 8. It's having the audit trail, having the evidence to back up what you're then going to be asked to prove later on. I had a bit of a bizarre case recently with an agent who'd got an HMO, individual tenancies in the property. One of the tenants was in rent arrears and he'd served a Section 8 on all of the tenants, even though they were on separate tenancy agreements, and got himself into a right state. So.
Yeah, and we come across the same, because obviously we're PayProp, we provide that record of the finances, so quite often our information is used as the evidence to take there, and some of that, it becomes quite problematic, even if I behave as if I have a tenancy in one way, but I collect the money and demand it in another, then if it's difficult for you or the tenant to understand, then a judge who doesn't sit there sitting property every day in, day out is probably going to have the same confusion.
Absolutely.
And who's also under time pressures and doesn't have the time to spend hours and hours on every case.
Yeah, I know Paul was saying that the average time now spent is around 15 minutes that they've got to decide on the situation for quite complex cases. So that the more you can make that easy for them to see the right route to follow, the more likely you are to actually get the judgment that you're looking for.
When do I start preparing for a dispute? not when it's going wrong, do it from day one of the tenancy.
Yeah, from day one of the tenancy.
Yeah. I think the one thing I will just add on to the notices before we move on to our next topic is that Section 8 and a Section 21 is only a notice. It is only a piece of paper. The confusion seems to be that these notices are an eviction. Once the Section 8 or the Section 21's time period has expired, only at that point does the landlord need to go to court. The tenant doesn't have to legally vacate at that point. They have every legal right to stay until the landlord's gone and actually got bailiffs. And I think sometimes there's the confusion that the actual notice is the eviction.
Yes. I mean, I would say, again, and you would know this from your citizens advice background, there was a piece of legislation that did say that they could take it for homeless or assistance support upon the issuing of the Section 21.
Correct.
But it does seem to be in practice that is now all the way through to bailiff. But I think that is more a capacity issue that has actually come about within the whole housing crisis, rather than it being a structure in law.
Yeah, absolutely. That was under Section 188 of the Housing Act, and with regards to the council's duty to carry out inquiries.
Yes.
As long as a tenant was threatened with homelessness, which is what a Section 21 is, the council had to start doing their inquiries. The issue you've got now, though, is capacity. Like you say, there's not enough housing officers to carry out those inquiries. So now they're sort of kicking the can down the road a little bit and saying, can you wait until you've got a bailiff and then we'll strive into action. But I do remember the former housing minister, and there's been a lot of them, Brandon Lewis, actually wrote an open letter to all council CEOs saying, don't do it if someone's bringing you a Section 21 Act on it. But the gatekeeping, I believe, is still going on.
So then if we move on, company lets and how and when to use them.
Yes. I would probably say this is getting more and more common now. The legal definition of a company let is a limited company renting a property for the sole purpose of housing their employees. That's the only reason you should be using a company let. However, a lot of rent-to-rent operators, so people who are renting a property to then rent it out themselves to then make a profit, are using company let agreements, and it's not the correct agreement, and landlords and agents themselves are falling foul of this. And this is where I just want to make it really clear, if somebody's coming to you as a rent-to-rent operator and they want to rent a property to rent it out, that's perfectly legal as long as the mortgage and the lease that the landlord holds allows that, as well as their insurance. But it must be a lease management agreement and not a company let. Company let shouldn't be used for anything other than a limited company putting their employees in the property. And if anybody wants a lease management agreement, we do have one of those in our templates for premium members as well.
Perfect.
Fantastic. Excellent.
I think just as a slight corollary from that, we also get inquiries from people who think that a tenancy agreement or a contract can be whatever they call it. So we get people calling tenancies licenses to try and avoid having to protect deposits and all the things that go with that. As you say, we've also got people doing ASTs for company tenants. So it isn't what it's called, it's the effect. If it looks like a dog and barks like a dog, it's a dog.
Yes, I also come across people who, with either company lets because they are less structured in their format, or I've even come across it with ASTs where people believe as long as they have put a clause in and the person has signed it, then I can hold them to it. Unfortunately, that is not the case.
No.
Statute law will always supersede anything that you've put in a contract.
And think about the wording as well. It's got to be readable. It's got to be understandable. Somebody who's, first language isn't English, or somebody who's not a technically savvy person needs to be able to read those contracts and have a reasonable understanding of what you're telling them they've got to do.
And I think, again, this is where we need to understand that when we're working in property, so many different elements of other law come into it. So contract law would come in at this point, where a contract needs to be balanced for both parties. It needs to be transparent and easy to be understood by a layperson, so somebody who's not of a legal background. So all of that contract law would actually be involved in you writing up any type of tenancy agreement or even terms of business with your landlords.
No, it's a really good point. And you mentioned PRS earlier. We have one case going through PRS at the moment with an agent who doesn't like the direction that the decision is going to take, which is that your contract isn't fair. And their response to that is, but it's clear and they've signed to it, so they're stuck with it. And they don't see there's a balance to that if those clauses are unfair or imbalanced.
And all you're going to tell them is how it's going to be viewed were it to go to a court process, because that is part of the determination that they will also have to make if it goes to legal route.
Absolutely.
So you're only giving an advice there. The next one I think has become contentious, and probably more so if we've seen energy prices increase. There was a huge rush to the bills inclusive agreement, and obviously now people are finding themselves in bills inclusive situation where the amount that they predicted within that bills inclusive to cover the energy situation isn't. So what kind of inquiries do you find around that?
Mainly the increase that landlords are needing to make, because obviously landlords' own costs have gone up. So whether that's the cost of council tax, we've seen a lot of that go up, cost of their own insurance, landlord licensing may have increased if you've got an HMO, which is predominantly where you'd see bills included, but also the energy use and the utilities themselves. So where you've got bills included, that would the tenant would be expecting to pay one lump sum of money and everything is covered. But landlords are finding that the usage may not have changed, but the pricing has, and they're actually in deficit every month, even though the tenant's paying their rent in full and on time. So the main inquiries that we're seeing is how can landlords increase the utility money, but maybe not the rent. First of all, you'd have had to broken that down in the contract that already specifies this is rent and this is utilities. A lot of contracts don't do that. You also have a very small window to be able to increase those costs. So when a tenancy comes to its fixed end of its fixed term, you then have a very small window as it turns into periodic to issue what's called a Section 1 form, which basically allows the landlord to change the utility costs, not affecting the rent. A lot of landlords don't know they can use that option, and then of course are trying to increase the rent under Section 13, which is the rent increase. The problem is you can only at the moment use that once every 12 months. So even if you've got a 6-month tenancy, you have to wait the full 12 months before you can increase. But I think a lot of it has to be communication. Fair use policies we're seeing coming along and being more and more common now. Tenants are being told that their fair use policy allows them to use up to this amount, either in cost or in wattage, and anything above that is then calculated out at a different rate and they're invoiced separately. So we're seeing lots of different solutions coming to the fore, but yeah, predominantly it's how do we increase the rent when it's just the utility bills that are being affected.
I do think that that element of a contribution agreement will become more common, because I think it does cover then that need to when do I increase it. Whereas if I outline within a contract, you've got this rental amount and you've got this amount towards bills that we will show and deduct over a course of a period, then they won't find themselves in those negative situations or in the difficulty of when do I increase this.
And back to what you said about prevention is better than cure. If you think you're going to want to enter into that type of contract, give us a buzz. You know, we can help you get it set up right at the beginning and prevent a lot of these problems further down the track.
The next one I think is, I think people know why. We get changes to it and changes that are announced as to when they're going to come into effect and then don't, as we saw recently with the last right to rent change. So a lot of people, it's am I using the right one? When do I use the new one?
Yeah, I mean, with right to rent, I think because everybody has to do it, you know, you can't get away with putting anybody in a property that you haven't checked they've got the right to rent in the UK. Even if they're a British citizen, born and bred here, never left the country, no passport, nothing, you're still going to make sure they've got the right to rent, to live in one of your rental properties. And predominantly we're seeing more and more of this with student lets, because they still need to be checked if they're coming into the private rented sector. Right to rent checks aren't required if they're going into like a hall of residence or something like that, because that's covered under the student establishment that they're going into. But if they're coming into an HMO or a shared house in the private rented sector, they must have right to rent, especially if they're coming from a far away country where they're not in the travel area, or they're not in the EEA, or even in the EU. Even though we've left the trading body for that, we're still in Europe. So we still need to check people coming from abroad. But they have simplified the right to rent now, thank goodness. And there are only 3 ways that you can check right to rent. That's manually, that is by using IDVT, is that right?
IDVT.
That right, there you go. And then obviously by somebody doing it over a video phone, which you can still do, but you must have seen the original documents to be able to do that. So it has been simplified, but it's still a bit of a grey area for people knowing when and how to do it, because we do see right to rent being carried out too far in advance. So you should only be carrying out right to rent checks a maximum of 28 days before someone's due to move into that property.
That's good.
Excellent. And then the last one on our list, access for inspections, stroke viewings. Quiet enjoyment of a tenancy seems to vary from agency to agency and landlord to landlord, and the interpretation.
Absolutely. I think the key thing here is whether you have it written into your tenancy agreement or not. When you give somebody an assured short hold tenancy, you are giving them possession in the eyes of the law. So that means they have the right to exclude anybody, including the landlord and their agent. So if a tenant wants to say, no, you're not coming in to inspect, you're not coming in to carry out viewings, there's nothing you can do. If you've got a clause in your tenancy agreement that says they must allow access, all you then have is a breach of tenancy. So you'd be serving a Section 8 notice, ground 12, any other breach, and you'd be going to court. Is a judge going to see on a discretionary ground 12 that it's reasonable to give possession just because a tenant was exercising their right to exclusive possession? Probably not. Depending on the seriousness of the need for the access, so if there is an emergency, there's a gas leak or something like that, you can actually apply to court for a warrant of entry, but that would need to be done specifically through the courts. You couldn't just put a note through the door relying on 24 hours notice. I know a lot of people think that once they've given 24 hours notice they can just go in. Doesn't work like that, unfortunately. So yeah, access for viewings and inspections, the tenants do have the right to say no.
Exactly.
I think it's not only the right to say no, the thing they need to, I think, also bear in mind that, and it comes up with that one that you mentioned, just because you serve a notice, you cannot assume consent.
Yes.
Consent is implicit.
It's not giving notice, it's giving notice and getting agreement.
Absolutely.
And getting agreement. That's right.
Yeah.
You can't take that non-reply is implicit consent.
Yeah. And also, just coming back to what we said about calling things licenses, we do sometimes see agents who call their agreements licenses, so I don't have to give you notice. Arguably, that's correct if it's a license. Leave aside whether it is actually a license and not an AST, but you've still got to get agreement. You know, you've still got to have their permission to enter the property. So
Absolutely.
There's always that bottom line that the tenant can say no.
Excellent. Now we've got here a couple of questions to kind of go into detail. For the purposes of it, these are not the actual names of the people that made it to protect their identities, but these are actual questions that have been received by HF Assist where you have provided assistance to a landlord or an agent. So if we cover this first one, the question from Alice.
So yeah, this is an agent who'd phoned us up to say we've taken over managing the property now. The old agent's got the sack, it's now us. Can you help us with issuing a new tenancy agreement for the tenants? They don't have to do that, of course. A tenancy agreement is, if you like, inherited, and it carries on its existing terms. They might want to do a new tenancy agreement. There's nothing to stop them doing that. But any new agreement has to be an agreement, so it would be with the tenants. You know, sign up to any revised terms and things. But I think the point is that agents sometimes confuse the AST with the management agreement. That's probably something they do need to be looking at.
I think quite often what happens within is they name the agent within the AST as receiving notices on behalf of. And so once the name is changed, they want to change that element of the AST and believe the only way to do that is the issuance of a new one. But obviously that's not the case.
Correct.
If there are changes within the agreement itself, they can actually make changes so long as it's not a material change to the AST itself.
Exactly, because predominantly the AST is a contract between the landlord and the tenant. The agent isn't party to that contract. They're actually there as the landlord's agent. So it doesn't need a new AST. And if there's a fixed term AST in place, the tenancy shouldn't be replaced anyway, because it's already in existence. So I think there is confusion there when people take over management, but really what they need to be doing is informing the tenant that they are now the new managing agent. They are the ones that need to be contacted. So under section 48, they need to be telling the tenant that this is the new address for service of notice, reporting of issues. And also section 3 of the Landlord and Tenant Act with regards to rent due. So the letting agent now needs to give the bank details and information to the tenant explaining that we are now the people that you need to pay your rent to. And until that section 3 has been given to the tenant, whether that be just in a form with enough information or physically as a section 3 notice, the rent isn't actually lawfully due. So that's something that agents need to be really key about. It's still lawfully due to the other people that the tenants were originally paying.
And obviously in today, it doesn't have to be that the agent was sacked.
No.
There are many reasons why we might take over a property. We've seen a lot of consolidation.
It may not have been
in the
managed
market.
by a previous agent. The landlord might have been doing it themselves and then decided to appoint an agent.
Absolutely.
So we're not so interested in what the reasons are. It's just what you do. But it's practicalities. Think about the practicalities. Don't sort of default to time for a new tenancy agreement.
But it's worth bearing in mind and understanding that practice, because if we change to assured tenancies, as is predicted within the Renters Reform Bill, then there will be no option to redo that tenancy.
Correct.
You will only be able to use the notices already written into law to be able to make those subsequent changes and inform about where the rent now needs to be paid. So get into that process now, and then when it changes for you, as we say, that prevention rather than the cure, you are already using the right method to be able to cope with those changes. So our next question comes from Dawn, and this one is regarding rent in advance. For whatever reason, the tenant has paid the money up front, 6 months, it's a periodic tenancy, he's now given notice to move out next month. Does the landlord have to return the 3 months of rent paid for the period after the tenant has vacated?
The very short answer to that is yes, absolutely. The tenant has given notice correctly. It's a periodic tenancy, so I assume they've given 1 month's notice or 3 months' notice, whatever the tenancy required them to do. They've paid rent past that period, so rent for that period is no longer legally due, so the landlord can't have it. Got to pay it back.
And there is quite often a question, particularly where it's a managing agent that is dealing with this, as to at what point the money is passed to the landlord. And I know various bodies and various discussions are looking at this, that just because you have received it as the managing agent, does that then mean that it's due for the landlord for situations like this? Because in actual fact, the tenant hasn't paid for a period which has yet fallen due.
Absolutely.
And you could argue that's not rent money until it's falls due as a rent payment.
Exactly.
However, I would say there are other arguments. I haven't yet used my water, but they want a year's worth in advance at the start of a year. So we have examples of this, which is why I think it becomes muddy waters as to what the process. But I think from the legal point of view, if they have followed everything through the legal law, and there is a period paid for which is now no longer going to be used, it needs to be returned. The service is not being provided and they have met all of the legal requirements of the contract, so therefore it must be returned. Excellent. And our next question was from Anil, and they increased the rent last month via email, but the tenant hasn't paid the increase. Can we issue a Section 8?
Again, a very short answer for that. Computer says no.
No.
Email is not a recognised form of increasing rent, even if you have a rent increase clause in your tenancy agreement. You'd need to be issuing it as a formal notice. Section 13 is the best way to increase rents. So that's 1 month's notice in line with the rent due date. That way, once the Section 13 is issued, if the tenant does not pay the increase and also doesn't appeal the rent increase, it falls due on the next rent due date. And yes, they would start falling into rent arrears and you can issue Section 8. In this particular situation, because the formal rent increase process wasn't followed, the landlord wouldn't be able to issue Section 8 because lawfully the tenant wouldn't fall into rent arrears.
I mean, just to clarify on that, what we're actually saying is it's not the method that has been used, it's the right section. If you have written into your contract that you can serve notices via email, then you can send the Section 13 increase via email and it be classed as served. it's actually the method that is used to increase that's important,
Yeah.
rather than the mode of delivery. What tool did you use?
Yeah. And again, coming back to this Section 8 notice, Section 8 is a breach of terms.
Yes.
And I think sometimes agents forget that. So with our tenant here not paying their rent, they're not under any obligation to pay that increased rent in that example. So therefore, Section 8 would never apply anyway.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, we have reached the end of our questions.
Yeah.
So what I would like to do is throw the floor open. And as we have, as you've heard, some very knowledgeable people sat to either side of me here, do we have any questions that have come up? Oh, we've had our technical people actually firing them over. And I can see a long list, right? Do you want to
We'll answer as
hit
many
the
as
floor
we can.
and we'll answer as many as we
Yeah.
can? How long do we have left? About 15 minutes.
Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes left, so we'll do our best.
Yeah.
So the first couple of questions are around student lettings and the Renters Reform Bill. So crash helmets on, gentlemen. So with the Rental Reform Bill, specific reference to student lets and fixed term contracts, what are the implications? Now, I do know when it was the white paper, we saw that student lets weren't going to be affected, but I don't really remember reading that in the bill.
It is in there within the bill. Unfortunately, it is problematic because it only makes reference to purpose-built student accommodation. I do think that this will need to be changed, and it will probably be challenged as it takes its passage through court. If you've got a student accommodation being treated similarly in HMO, so as a class 4 planning clause, quite a lot of places in student and university towns do not allow that class to be changed.
Yeah.
So now we have a class which is dictating you to use it for student accommodation, which you can't physically change, but you don't get the same protection of purpose-built student accommodation.
That disparity.
So that disparity will need to be addressed as to what happens if your accommodation has been legally determined by the local authority to be used for student accommodation. And I think they would need to be folded into this. And I know the reason that they'll do it is because it's the sui generis, the fact that there is no planning class for purpose-built student. They're actually excluded. But I think we do need to answer where it's the class 4. The difficulty is obviously class 4 also covers general HMO.
Yeah.
So as a landlord, you could physically change it from a student to a normal HMO accommodation. So how would they cover that?
Yeah.
They may look at maybe a new class that allows you to have a specific, like we can have HMO or multiple application with care, say like a class 3B, whether they create a class 4B to cover just student accommodation, which could then be rolled into this. I think as with most of it, when we're looking at the rental reform bill, it's going to come back to we need more detail. There's just not enough in the bill for us to be able to make a determination as to how that will play out.
Sticking slightly with student lets, we rent a student property directly to the local university. Is this a company let or something different?
Well,
that's a great question, by the way.
It is, but I think if we come back to that definition, company let is a limited company using it for their own employees. I'm sure my daughter may feel it at time at university, but she is not employed by the university. So in clear definition and legal termination,
I think
it would be possibly not.
Possibly not. I think you'd have to check what is the legal entity that provides the education.
Yeah.
Who is the animal that you're entering into a contract with will be part of that question. If they're a limited company in their own right, arguably it would be outside AST.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't believe that it is an AST that should be being provided. I'm just not sure it is a company let.
Yeah.
So it's where it falls as to what needs to be used, and it may be a separate agreement that is required. And things like this is what they're really going to have to look out for when they're coming into these periodics and how they're used. And this is why I think from the moment it was announced, student letting has been viewed as a minefield for getting rid of any kind of fixed term agreement.
Okay, moving on to rent now. So what is the correct agreement for rent to rent? Now, we did pick up on that earlier on in this webinar, and the correct agreement is a lease management agreement. And like I say, we do have a copy of that for our premium members if you wish to purchase one of those.
Well, if you follow it all the way through, it's a lease management agreement between the person wanting to do the rent to rent and the ultimate owner of the property, the head landlord. And then the rent-to-rent agreement between the person who has been given the right and the subsequent tenant. At the moment, that would be an AST, but would actually then be an open-ended agreement. So again, that becomes problematic. What are the termination rights of your lease management agreement should we change to these new contracts? Because if you've got a fixed term within your lease management agreement, but you have an open-ended tenancy, what happens at the end of that lease management? You know, as we found with rent repayment orders, and I know it's still gone up and been challenged as to whether it passes on to the head landlord, could we find the same happening with agreements? That actually, although you do a rent to rent, if that comes to an end and the landlord takes it back with the tenant in situ, are they then bound by the same rights and regulations of that contract?
Absolutely.
I think sometimes where we see it go wrong is that they try to use, for example, an AST for both, so that they know that they mirror each other with regards to things like those notice periods. But obviously they can't both be the same type of agreement. So I think it's two things: get the right agreement in the right place, but also think about how they impact each other and how they carry across.
And that follows on really nicely to the next question, actually, Mike. Where do I stand when I already have in place company lets and AST agreements for rent-to-rent operators?
And seek to replace them with the right agreement by agreement.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I would probably say there, just to add to that, again, what you were speaking about earlier, it doesn't matter what you call an agreement. So even if you've got company lets and ASTs in the wrong place, the law will take over and the law will determine what contractual obligation either side has. So it's not too much of an issue that you've got the wrong paperwork, because the law will determine what you've actually got. But moving forward and for best practice, get the right agreements in place so everybody knows which hymn sheet they're singing from.
The main problematic is a company let doesn't necessarily have all the clauses and procedures that you would want within a lease management contract. So you may find yourself, you think you've used the right agreement and giving yourself the best protection, but actually changing to the lease management will be the best protection for all parties involved. Now, that being said, if you explained that to a landlord and through yourself that actually this is the best practice and we're getting set up for the Renters Reform Bill, if anything, you have the right mode and change now to be using it for that prevention.
Gets ahead of the game.
I'd also say with an AST, we need to be mindful that you can only have an AST with an individual. And by that, I mean a human being, not a company or any other false entity. So joint tenancies, they're all human beings. That's fine. You can have a joint AST. But it also must be that the person is occupying the property. So 9 times out of 10, the rent-to-rent operators aren't living in the property. So an AST requires occupation, but it also requires that person to have that property as their main and principal home. So unless all of those things are being ticked, you can't have an AST.
What you called it.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what you've called it. So going on to access now. What about access for gas certificates? Surely a tenant has no choice but to allow us in because that's for safety.
That's what we covered before, wasn't it?
Absolutely. They can rightly refuse.
Yeah, they can rightly refuse. However, you will have within or should have within your tenancy agreement that it is their responsibility to allow you to keep the property safe and compliant. And so therefore, again, that would come under breach grounds under Section 8 Ground 12, that they've actually not allowed you to fulfill the obligations of the tenancy agreement.
So it's either, you say, go down the termination route or apply to court for a court order for access to deal with the safety issue.
And I know what the second element of that question is going to be. Someone's going to ask, but if I haven't got the gas certificate done, how on earth can I use a Section 21? Well, it is a bit of a double-edged sword, but thankfully, if you can document very, very clearly the amount of times you've attempted to get that gas certificate done, the fact you don't have one won't void your Section 21.
No. Nobody's expecting you to perform the impossible.
No.
But do your best endeavours and record it back to audit trails again.
Yeah, absolutely. So our next question, if the Section 21 has been issued, could we possibly have an agreement with the tenant for their move out date? Let's say the end date of the Section 21 is the 6th of June. Could we gently probe the tenants to give us a move out date and tell us when so we can negotiate with the landlord? Or is there an exception that we would consider that as harassment?
That's a very difficult one, because it depends on how you approach. There is nothing to stop agreement being made during that period that the tenant, however, you do have to follow a fine line that you are not seen to be pressuring the tenant or causing them harassment.
Yeah.
So that's going to come down to how you approach it. A very nicely worded letter that is given to them that waits for the tenant to respond and causes the action would be very hard to judge as harassment.
Yeah.
However, visiting the house multiple times to speak to them face to face would probably be harassment and interrupting their quiet enjoyment of the tenancy during their protected
how
time.
it's delivered and its frequency.
Correct.
I always say when people ring up with this exact question that if you're following the same processes that debt collectors have to follow when it comes to harassment and how often you can contact somebody, if you're following that to the letter, you should be good to go and it shouldn't be harassment.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so this is just a quick question with regards to increasing utility bills in the portion of the rent. What is the section? So it's not a section that you use, it's a specific form. And if you go onto your preferred search engine and put in assured forms, pick the one that clicks to the government website and you need form number 1. Form number 1 is the one that helps you increase the utility costs rather than the rent. We will not be able to issue tenancy agreements with a fixed term when the new bill comes in. Is this going to be periodic agreements from the day the tenant moves in? The answer to that is yes.
It is, and there are certain things that are then allowed from that first date. So the tenant is allowed to issue notice immediately, but it's a 2-month notice period that's been placed within. So in essence, although it is a periodic, it is a minimum 2-month tenancy that has been put in. I know there are some people worried that open-ended means people will be using this for short lets. This has already happened with PRTs in Scotland. We didn't see that happen. Edinburgh, which is probably the biggest short let area of people wanting to go, we haven't seen the PRTs being used for holiday lets, which is their worry when it was introduced. Then there are certain mechanisms that you can use for serving notice, but all of those are restricted to the first 6 months of the tenancy. So for intents and purposes from the landlord side, even were you to have a permitted ground, you are allowing that tenant in for a minimum of 6 months.
Absolutely. I'm going to just move these questions about because the other one follows on to that. When the periodic only AST comes into play, well, it won't be an AST. We're not having assured short hold tenancies anymore. It will just be an assured tenancy. We're losing the short hold bit. Will there still be an initial sign up fixed term that will roll into periodic, or could tenants move in and after a month give notice?
As we just said on that one, absolutely. And unfortunately, they wouldn't have to wait a month. In essence, they could move in and the following day issue you notice and be there for 2 months. In practicality, that is not how I believe it will be used. And looking at PRTs, that is not. Over the past years, we've seen how they have played out. But written to the law, that is actually what they are able to do.
Absolutely. And the second part of that question is, how does this affect our fees if we're doing a let only or if we're doing a finder's fee for management?
Cool. I mean, that, for the whole industry, that is going to be a change in process and practice. This is not a small change. And I know Mike referenced earlier the Tenant Fees Act was another big change. We need to view this in the same way. The idea of finding the tenant will now need a fixed charge for finding the tenant, not dependent upon the length of time that person then stays within a property. Same with let only. It's not the let only, it is the creation of the agreements and the tenancy, which all takes place at the start. So we'll need to think about how we do that, bill it and change it. The fact that it is a percentage of what the rent is expected to be over the term of a year is actually giving a value to the service. At the moment, we've been able to assure the landlord that he's going to get that amount because he has that time period. That protection for the landlord is going to go, and we might need to change our messaging. But for an agent, the cost of the transaction and how it has been valued, I don't see us changing, because you are still going to follow a lot of the same process. the same checks, the right to rent that was said that need to be done, the creation of the agreements, the finding and vetting of that tenant will still need to take place. And that has a value set by the market. Yeah, that won't change. How we market it and how we message it to the landlords is what we probably will need to change.
And the ongoing management fee is I think the bigger challenge, isn't it?
So now we're on the money now. We've got 2 minutes and 2 questions. So
okay.
I need to be getting this down to the wire now. So the next question is, what is the process to evict a tenant who is not paying rent, but there is no AST or any other written document in place?
Well, again, it comes back to what we've said before, that the law will look at the effect of the contract. There isn't anything that in law that says you have to have a written tenancy agreement, unless it's for more than 3 years and that's a deed. But a normal tenancy agreement, it doesn't actually say it has to be in writing. So if the tenant's occupying it as their principal private residence, they've got exclusive possession, they're paying rent in the same way as any other tenant would do, then you can treat that as an AST and go down the usual route, give notice and then seek an eviction.
So long as the other things to make it an actionable AST have taken place.
Yeah.
And again, that goes back to case law, which is Street v Mounsford, which gave us the hallmarks of a tenancy.
Yes, exactly.
And the final question, because we are right on the money now.
Just one thing though, don't take from what we've just said, oh, that's okay, then I don't need to bother about issuing written tenancy agreement.
No.
You do.
And also, in
practice.
the Renters Reform Bill, you will have to issue written tenancy agreements, so don't make it common practice that you don't.
Yeah.
So final question, back to the Renters Reform Bill. Do you expect Section 8 notices to have the requirement for service of documents the same as Section 21 does now under the Deregulation Act? I've read that bit. I can answer that one. I read that bit. The answer is yes. So Section 8 has sort of taken over from Section 21. If you haven't got all your ducks in a row with regards to your compliance documentation, you won't be able to issue a valid Section 8. Same with deposit. If you haven't protected the deposit, it'll affect it in exactly the same way as it currently affects Section 21. So you won't be able to issue your Section 8 until you've paid the deposit back in full, and then you'll be able to issue. So exactly the same rules. So yes, it'll be exactly the same process.
Section 21, but not all the protections that go behind.
Absolutely. So that's all of the questions that we've had through. So thank you so much for that. It's always really good to have your interaction. And I'll hand back over to Neil.
So I think the last thing we want to do, I want to thank you for inviting me here and letting this go out to our PayProp users. Hopefully you can see a benefit in having access to a couple of brains like this and many more that run the team behind. But what we have actually also are going to do is we have done a collaboration between PayProp and HF Assist that will allow a discount for PayProp customers to be able to access the standard or the premium at a 10% discount. We will do a separate communication following this where we will also give you a copy of this recording. There's a lot of good nuggets and information that I'm sure you want to go back and listen to what they've said. And as part of that communication, we'll also give you the code for you to use when communicating to HF Assist and proving to them that you are a PayProp customer to get that discount.
I think as well, I mean, I'm sure there'll be a number of people who subscribe today who aren't PayProp customers, so just to make sure they don't feel unloved as well. Equally, you're very welcome to join HF Assist as well. If any of you are already Hamilton Fraser customers using another Hamilton Fraser product, then we can offer you a discount on HF Assist as well. So get in touch.
Yeah, I definitely think it is a value, and in a changeable market, as many voices as we can get. So thank you very much for your time. We've ran over just a little bit, but hopefully it's been of value. I would just do as a final, we will include, as we have on here on the recording, our emails for those that have not been able to attend. We will try to get to any questions that you've got. So if you're watching this on demand, please do use the phone and the email, because we will get back to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.